Let me suggest an overview for what I can call perhaps the state of the nation of Israel, to go beyond the daily reports and daily events to a broader perspective, trying to assess on the domestic level, on the regional level, and the international global level, how is Israel standing today? And let me say something before I go specifically into all these three categories, something very general. Do we have very serious problems in Israel domestically, in the Middle East, and on the global scene? Yes. Are some of the challenges new and we have not had experience in dealing with them? So we could be facing the kind of problems that we've not seen in the past, and maybe we don't exactly know today how to respond to them effectively. Yes. But is the situation on all three levels basically good and on some issues very, very good? Yes. So that beyond the specific issues, the overall picture is extremely encouraging. Let me start domestically. We all know that the Israeli political system is malfunctioning. We all know that we are not getting, and I don't think we will get it on the fifth elections now in November, we are not getting a clear decision and a stable government, and the possibility of 6 elections is really serious, and this is negative. I don't think anybody likes it on each side of the political aisle. I don't think that anybody is excited about having a permanent situation of no decision. But we should go beyond the political question and ask ourselves about the society and the institutions. And my basic argument is that whereas the political system is not functioning and probably will not function very soon in a positive way, the Israeli society and Israeli institutions compensate for it. And we cannot look even at the political crisis without seeing what is happening in other democracies. In other words, if I look at the American experience, it is more divided than even the Israeli political scene. When I look at what is happening in other democracies, but in the United States, you actually have something bordering on a cold civil war, so that not only the political system is not functioning, the society is not functioning well beyond just the political system. Look at Europe, look at other democracies throughout the world. The difficulties are enormous, and in most places, you cannot get a stable government based on the preference of the people of one school or another school. And these governments are inherently unstable. They cannot address midterm and long-term problems because they all are obsessed with political survival. Again, this is true in most European countries. It is true in the United States. It is true in democracies all over the world and in Israel. But what we have in Israel is very encouraging for two reasons: the society and the institutions. There is a way to look at these problems and make a judgment about how deep and serious and long-term they are. Israel faced recently at least 4 major crises and one extremely important strategic opportunity. And in all these 5 cases, the Israeli society and the Israeli institutions performed quite well, in many cases much better than other democracies. And whereas they would have functioned extremely well if we had in addition also a stable government, nevertheless, the fact that they essentially managed to respond effectively to the challenges and use the opportunity, not miss the opportunity, is very encouraging. Let us look at all four of them. An economic crisis, a security crisis, a health crisis, and a political crisis. First of all, the economic crisis that was the most threatening, because when the world economy is getting into a very uncertain stage, the Israeli economy survived the coronavirus in a way that is better than most Western democracies. Again, if we would have had a stable government, things would have been better. If we didn't have this problem that for a while we didn't have a budget, we would have been more successful. But if you look at the Israeli growth, if you look at the level of unemployment, if you look at every economic standard I can think of, we are doing reasonably well, better than most democratic countries. Let me, in this particular regard, speak also about the institution, because wherever you speak about a challenge and a response, the institution is critical. You have here in the Ministry of Finance, particularly the budgets department in the Ministry of Finance, and it managed to keep the Israeli economy running and relatively succeeding in the categories that I just mentioned. You have the Bank of Israel that is responsible for the solidity of the Israeli financial structure. And these functioned well. The shekel is too strong for our own good. I mean, if you look what's happening with inflation, if you look at the strengths of the Israeli shekel compared to the dollar, compared to the euro, compared to other currencies, if you look at the problems of the Israeli economy, they're manageable. And most of the important problems are in Israel structural, and unfortunately we didn't find a good response to them, have nothing to do with the recent crisis. In other words, also a stable government did not deal with them very well. I'm speaking primarily about the cost of living that is very high in Israel by every standard you can possibly think of, and the major problem of Israelis being able to purchase their own apartments. In Israel, you have less leasing than in other democracies. So this is a critical element here in Israel. And that's not good, but that's not a product of the recent crisis. We had it also when we had a stable government. We will have to deal with it, but we survived the economic crisis much better than others. The health crisis in Israel, the COVID, again, is it excellent? No. Would it have been better if the Israeli society were in a better situation? We have a very major problem in Israel with two parts of the population, and both of them large part of the population. I mean, ultra-Orthodox on the one hand, and Muslim Arabs on the other, that were not cooperating with what the authorities very strongly suggested and needed, and it made our dealing with the corona crisis more difficult. But nevertheless, again, we are at least as well, and in most cases better, than other countries, other democratic countries. And again, you must take it back to the institutions. In Israel, the most important institution in this regard is the health insurance, and we have a system in Israel which reaches practically everybody. This is much better than in the United States and in Canada. It is also better than most countries in Europe. So again, you have the society dealing with it relatively effectively, but the institutions here helped enormously. The third crisis was, and still is, the crisis of security. And we're having challenges from all over the place, starting with Iran and the nuclear threat, continuing with the fact that the Iranians are waging war against Israel on a number of levels, including cyber, but primarily trying to surround Israel with its own proxies and with its own arms and positions from which to launch missiles to Israel. We are engaged in a preventive war with Iran. We were engaged in two confrontations, major confrontations in Gaza. We're also on the brinks of a confrontation constantly with Lebanon, where we speak about more than 100,000 missiles that can reach centers of population in Israel. And we managed these security challenges quite well, in spite of the fact that we did not have for a long time, and don't have today, a stable government that enjoys the support of a solid majority of the people. And again, the institutions are very important. The Israeli military, the IDF, the intelligence community, we are used to deal with these challenges. We are prepared. We have responded to them. We have basically a success. It's a very frustrating success because there is no solution once and for all to these issues, but there is a way to respond to it and to respond to it effectively and to maintain our strategic deterrence. So it is functioning well, thanks to a very resilient society and a very effective set of institutions, the security establishment that deals with it in a very effective way. Take even the political crisis. We could have had, because of the very bitter fighting over the over political power, and the fact that some people, a lot of prominent people went very, very low in what they were willing to do in order to undermine the other side, we could have had a challenge to the very democratic system of Israel. Now, anybody who's not in power says that democracy is falling apart, but this is part of the propaganda. Again, it is always the people who are not in power. When the left is not in power, then the right is fascist. And when the right is not in power, then the left must be engaged in treason against Israel. This kind of rhetoric you expect, and in Israel it's very bitter and very loud. But if you look at the rules of the game, the entire political system works. It doesn't work well, but the fact that governments come and go based on very minor changes and everybody accepts the rules of the game. And whereas there is a lot of disagreement concerning the power of the judiciary, nevertheless, once the judiciary makes a decision, it is respected by everybody in power. The system works, the rule of the game work. So when you have four crises, again, an economic one, a security one, a health crisis, and a political crisis, nevertheless, the institutions work, the society is backing it in spite of the weakness of the political system. Last but not least in this category, we have had a major opportunity concerning our position in the Arab world. I will speak about it in a moment when I speak about regional realities. And both governments, those of Netanyahu and those that called itself the government of change, acted in a way that did not miss the opportunity. The one government, the Netanyahu government, was helped very much by the Trump administration to establish the Abraham Accords. And then the other government was helped by the Biden administration to deepen these accords. And both parties were very responsible in nourishing in the Arab world the understanding in continuing to convince Arab states that they must cooperate very deeply in Israel for their own good, That's very important. Both governments did it, so we didn't miss an opportunity, a tremendously important opportunity, because of the division in the political system. And one extremely positive thing that you can learn from the last government. This last government was basically the one that is still in power as a transitional government because we're having elections. This government proved what every far-sighted Israeli should see and didn't always see, namely that there is no real difference between right and left in Israel. Inside this government, you have the whole spectrum of the Israeli mainstream, with the exception of the very, very radical and the very, very deep right and the very, very deep left. So they don't matter. What is important is that about 2/3 of the Israelis are in the middle of the political spectrum, and they agree about practically everything, even when they want certain things changed. Let me give you a few examples. If you look at socioeconomic issues, there isn't really in Israel real socialism. I don't think anybody is ridiculous enough to think that socialism is the answer for Israel. And on the other hand, you don't have extreme capitalism either, and you wouldn't be able to push it through. The whole discussion is about moving the welfare state a little to the right or a little to the left. It is not a major issue. And by the way, it is not even seriously raised in the 5 election campaigns that we had here. On security, we have a total agreement in Israel, an overwhelming agreement, again, in the mainstream, about Iran being the worst and the most dangerous enemy, and the fact that we must prepare ourselves and we must continue with the preventive war, even if it could deteriorate into an all-out war. And Israelis realize what an all-out war is. It means that their cities will be bombarded in a very major way. So they realize this is not something that is happening in the front, and let alone not overseas, somewhere thousands of kilometers, like other democracies have to deal with. We are having here a very, very broad consensus, almost total consensus, when it comes to Iran, namely the real security issue. And even when it comes to the Palestinians, whereas people have a different vision about how the end situation should be, how finally, if it ever comes, there is once and for all a settlement of this problem. Nevertheless, everybody agrees on 2 things. First of all, at the moment, we should not annex the West Bank to Israel. And on the other hand, the Palestinian national movement is not a partner for a historic compromise. There was a very bitter division in Israel until the Second Intifada, until the turn of the century, about 20 years ago. Now, most Israelis realize that what you have on the Palestinian side is an irresponsible leadership, an irresponsible political community, people who want to undermine the very existence of the state of Israel, who are not nation builders, who cannot be taken seriously as partners for a historic compromise. So even on that issue, you have so little confrontation that, again, people on the extremes, not the very extreme, but the extremes of the political spectrum could work together in the same government. So if you look at economic and socioeconomic issues, security issues, here and there are differences. I'm not saying there are not differences at all, but we don't have a situation where you have 2 schools of thought who really would take the country in one clear direction or another. The difference between the policies of the Netanyahu government and the post-Netanyahu government that we're having now is not very fundamental. On the most important issues, both domestically and in foreign policy, there is a very wide agreement. And I think that this is a good sign when it comes to a country like Israel, because particularly when you have to deal with such serious dangers as I will mention in a moment, it is extremely important that the society is not torn apart. Now, again, we have a major problem with Arabs and a major problem with ultra-Orthodox. But the mainstream of the society that anyhow, this is what makes Israel. What makes Israel is not the Arabs and not the ultra-Orthodox. It is the non-ultra-Orthodox Jews, including Orthodox, but not ultra-Orthodox Jews, and the Druze, if you, it's a very small community, but it's important to say that it's not only Jews, but they are the people who make the Israeli success. Okay, the others simply don't play a major positive role, and most of them are more of a burden for a modern state than an asset. So this part of the Israeli society that carries the others on its shoulders is basically functioning well. Let us go to the regional level and discuss two things. One that is a very, very major problem, and there is a magnitude to this problem that we have not witnessed before, namely the Iranian challenge. And then what is happening between Israel and the Arab states. The first is very problematic with strong negative elements. The second has seen more positive change than we have seen for generations. Let's start with the problematic. Let's start with the bad news. We're coming closer and closer to a confrontation with Iran. Iran is a serious enemy, much more serious than the Arabs that we've had before. This is a strong society, and the tragedy is that you have the combination of a very impressive society with a barbaric leadership. Now, we've had 80 years ago in Europe also this combination that was very dangerous, namely a very able society in Germany with a barbaric leadership of Adolf Hitler, and it caused enormous problems. I'm not suggesting the Ayatollahs are another Hitler or something, but again, what we have here is a society that is very impressive, that can be sophisticated, that can think strategically, that is scientifically advanced, that is technologically advanced, that can challenge Israel militarily on levels that we have not seen before, that can use proxies in a more sophisticated way than anybody before. And this is a regime that governs over these people. And as long as they don't overthrow these barbarians who have taken over Iran and are leading Iran, the combination of their abilities, of the Iranian abilities, and the barbaric nature of the regime is extremely dangerous to Israel. And not only from the nuclear point of view. The nuclear point of view is important because what the Iranians want is to give themselves immunity so that they can undermine countries in the Middle East, and they can dominate the whole region and use the resources of this region to become a power of the kind that can threaten not only Israel, but also Europe, and potentially even be an important and very disruptive element in world affairs. And if they have immunity, or if they think they have immunity and become more radical because they even wrongly think that they have immunity because of their nuclear project, that's a major problem. And from an Israeli point of view, there is another major problem, and this is on the borders of criminal negligence, what the West has done with the Iranian nuclear project. Particularly President Obama, who's more responsible for the very sad affairs that we're seeing here today than anybody else. The idea is that you wait until the Iranians, and this is what Obama did. He waited until the Iranians got 100% of enrichment. In other words, the whole cycle of enrichment. He waited until they got everything they wanted. And then he signed an agreement and led the Europeans in signing an agreement that postponed for a while something that was not urgent anyway. And this is the official material, because he did not put any restrictions on three other things that are very important: the weaponization, the ballistic missiles, and the attempts of the Iranians to hegemonize the region. So he asked the Iranians to wait with something that is not urgent, because as long as there are no missiles and no weapon program, weaponization that can put a bomb into a ballistic missile, you don't need the enriched uranium. So you postpone the enrichment, allowing them to develop the more sophisticated centrifuges that will make it faster, 6 times faster, and then even faster. And for this delay, that means very little, allowed them, legitimized them to build the missiles. He did not even try to restrict it. The kind of structure of control over the weaponization was such that the Iranians could bypass if they wanted. And more important than anything else, he basically accepted their attempt to dominate the region, which will make them a power even without a huge power, even without a nuclear weapon, let alone when the nuclear option gives them the opportunity of being immune to prevent them from doing what they're doing in taking over the Middle East. So the fact that the Iranian economy could have been crushed and wasn't, and then when Trump withdrew from the agreement, he only had 3 years. If he would have had 7 years, then the sanctions would have done a lot of damage, and the sanctions did a lot of damage. But the Americans were obsessed with a complete misperception of the Middle East, understanding nothing that happens in this region. Obama was the worst because it was also 8 years. We had a president before who also misperceived the Middle East, but Sadat saved us from him. I'm speaking about Jimmy Carter. But Obama was the worst that you could possibly have in this regard, because he allowed the Iranians to get almost everything they wanted in a system that would also legitimize it after a while, because of the sunset clause in the agreement. So the JCPOA, the combination is the barbarism of the Iranians and the profound misperceptions, misunderstanding, wrong policies of the Obama administration and the Europeans, that without American leadership could not go in any different direction, and anyway cannot be trusted when it comes to world affairs. And this problem is now facing Israel, because if the Iranians only want, they can get the renewal of this agreement, which means even less now, and hundreds of billions of dollars will flow into Iran, save it from its critics and its opponents from the inside, and make it possible for them to dominate the region. So what we have here is a major problem that Israel must deal with, and Israel is preparing. We realize that the only way you can prevent Iran from reaching a point that Israel cannot live with is to do it by force, and Israel is preparing itself with a very wide consensus to prevent it by force, because that's the only way you can deal with it. So that's the bad news. Here's the good news. For a very long period of time, generations, the number one fear of Israel was that all the Arabs will pull together all the resources and bring it to bear in a war against Israel under one single leadership. And we had such a limited challenge in 1939, when they managed, because they threatened the British on the eve of the Second World War, they managed to change the British policy from being pro-Zionist to anti-Zionist, which at the time was tremendously important. But the Second World War changed it because Britain was no longer an important world power. And we had another event, namely the Six-Day War, where Arab potential throughout the region that Nasser called from the ocean to the Gulf, namely from the Atlantic Ocean to the Arab Gulf or Persian Gulf, came together against Israel. And for a very long period of time, for generations, the number one objective of Israel is to break this Arab solidarity so that there is no one Arab leader, one Arab country that can mobilize the whole resources, the huge resources of the Arab world. And I'm speaking about oil and gas and money and votes in the United Nations and markets and international waterways and what have you. And the problem was, how do we find allies in the Arab world? And for a very long time, and it ended about 50 years ago, for a very long time, Israel tried to find a way to remove Egypt as the cornerstone of this alliance, to remove it from a participation in violent confrontations with Israel. And we succeeded with that in 1979, and this changed Israel. It changed Israel in a fundamental way. The Israeli army became much smaller. Our defense budget, that used to be for a long period of time, 23% of the Israeli GDP, just to put things in proportion, the Europeans have somewhere between 0.75% and 1.5%, and now they're trying, and some of them are already reaching 2%. Israel had 23% of its GDP invested in security. After the peace with Egypt, we managed to bring it down dramatically over time, and now we're about 5.5%, 6%, which is high, but not as prohibitively high for the economy, for any other objective, as we were for a very long period of time. And what is happening recently is that not only Egypt that made peace with Israel in 1979, and Jordan that made peace in 1994, make peace with Israel, but something very fundamental happened in the Arab world during the so-called Arab Spring. Arabs and many Europeans and Americans, many academics, had this misperception that what is wrong with the Arab world are some leaders that are irresponsible or radical or tyrannical or crazy, if you look at Gaddafi's case. So once the Arabs will rise against the leaders, then this will produce inevitably a democratic or somewhat democratic or democratizing or somewhat more pluralistic leadership, and also that Arabs can finally meet the challenges of the 21st century, and therefore they will be perhaps less hostile, less radical, because they will be able to give themselves the good life that people want. And the perception was, let just the Arabs rise and we will see what will happen. And then the Arabs rose in the Arab Spring. And the result was much worse than before. Because what people did not realize, and I've been talking for decades about it, with extreme difficulty to convince people, particularly in academia and in politics, that you have something structural in Arab societies that is prohibitive when it comes to pluralization of the Arab world, to the ability to have not only a more pluralistic political system, but also a more pluralistic social system, a system that can support a modern state with science, with technology, with participating in what is happening outside the Arab world and so on. And unfortunately, we had this very clear evidence that not only is it not happening, but things are getting worse. Let me perhaps give an example just to amplify what I've just said. What can be worse than a leader like Gaddafi? Okay, and then with the help of Europeans, they bring Gaddafi down and Gaddafi is dead. What do we have in Libya today? We have a situation worse than under Gaddafi. Now, Libya is rich beyond the imagination of anybody because it has this gas so close to Europe that it can sell and it can market and it has a low level of sulfur and everything a country can want. And people can't live there. And the reason is the political culture of the Arab world, particularly the lack of pluralism in Arab societies, much deeper than in the political system. We spoke in Israel about the political system being problematic, but the society being strong. In the Arab world, the weakness is in the society. This is the problem. This is why Lebanon disintegrates. This is why you don't have a single democracy throughout the Arab world, or a single even democratizing country. The hopes about Tunisia were also not very successful, as we've seen recently. So there isn't even a system that is developing slowly, even too slowly, in this direction. And for the first time, in the awareness of Arabs, very, very deep in Arab awareness, is the fact that the Arabs are weak, that the structures, that the Arab states are weak, that they're incapable in the short run. I don't know what will happen in the distant future, but I'm speaking about the foreseeable future. They're incapable of dealing with the challenges of the 21st century. And as an Israeli, I'm saying it with sorrow. I wish I could point at something in Egypt that will bring Egypt to a position where Egypt can deal with feeding 110 million Egyptians. It would be much better for Israel, let alone for Egypt, of course for Egypt, but also for Israel, because Egypt is an anchor of stability in the Middle East, and Egypt being either hungry or on the verge of hunger is good for nobody in the Middle East except the radicals. So there is an awareness and an understanding in the Arab world that the Arabs are very weak. And there is also an understanding at the same time that Iran is very strong and that Iran has ambitions to hegemonize the whole region, and that the Iranians are strong enough to do it, and the Arabs are weak to the point where they cannot defend themselves. They're not strong enough to defend themselves. And particularly after Obama, that you can't trust the Americans because they have these ridiculous ideas about the Middle East, particularly under Obama. And here comes the fourth element. Combine Arab weakness, Iranian threats, American position where you can't trust them, and the dependability of Israel. Arabs realized that you can't trust the Americans, but you can trust the Israelis. Now, Israel is far less important than America, but much more reliable. The Israelis will fight the Iranians because they must fight the Iranians. They can't afford not to fight the Iranians. The Americans may or may not, and they may support or may not support. And then they have these strange ideas that even when Biden comes to power, and Biden is by far not as bad as Obama, but his first instinctive move is to undermine Saudi Arabia and to support the Houthis in Yemen by taking them off the terrorist list and trying to undermine the Saudi war in Yemen and speaking about human rights. Now, all of these things are very nice and very good if you isolate them from the strategic picture. Yes, support human rights. Yes, there's a cruel war in Yemen, try to stop the war. But if you look at the overall picture, is you're supporting the bad guys and you're undermining the people who are willing to work with you. And they're not perfect. And they don't have your system of values. And they're very different than you, and not in a positive way, as seen from Washington and from Jerusalem. But when you can see how dangerous Iran is, how weak the Arabs are, how untrustworthy the Americans are, and how dependable the Israelis are, it brings the Israelis and the Arabs together on a level we've never seen before. We used to have this very simple-minded perception of saying there is this tiny Israel on the one hand and this huge Arabs on the other, the Arabs. And the idea was there's no question of where the American or the European bread is buttered. It's buttered on the Arab side because they have oil, they have money, they have gas, they have votes in the United Nations, they have markets, they have waterways, and Israel is tiny. And the simple-mindedness of this approach, not understanding that most Arabs are afraid of Arab radicals. And once you work with Israel and with the Arab world, most Arab states, against the radicals, then what you have is a completely different picture. Israel and the non-radical Arabs and the United States and Europe have the same interest in the relative stability of the Middle East, or if you want, less instability in the Middle East, if you want to be more realistic. And the radicals are the ones that are isolated, provided you know how to isolate them. Now, Nixon knew how to do it. Johnson knew how to do it. Kissinger knew how to do it. Carter went with the wrong part. Obama went, again, with the radicals because he believed if he can make the radicals to make them moderate, then everybody will be happy and we will all ride into the sunset and live happily ever after. This simple-minded perception of the Middle East. And Obama undermined Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Israel, namely American allies, and basically gave Iran the deal that made it possible for her to hegemonize the Middle East much better than before, with American consent, basically. Not with the consent to the objectives, but with basically helping them to get there. And that's the important thing. So what we have in the region is an extremely positive, from an Israeli point of view, reality today, where you have on the one hand an Israeli-Arab coalition vis-a-vis the radicals, primarily Iran, to some extent Turkey. Erdogan is a radical that learned recently that he cannot show himself as radical. So at the moment, he is willing to play down his radical attempts, including his attempts to hegemonize the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. But the important thing is that there is an Israeli-Arab coalition. So Israel, oil, gas, markets, votes, and it are on the same side. So when Biden wants to undo some of the damage of Obama and undo some of the damage of his initial policies in the Middle East, and he wants to persuade Saudi Arabia to produce more oil so that the pumps in Louisiana will not charge as much as when the Saudis are not willing to compensate for oil that the United States is losing after the Ukraine war. The result is that he needs to speak to Israel because the Israelis on some issues would trust, I'm sorry, the Saudis would on some issue trust the Israelis no less than Americans, sometimes even more. So Israel can work together with the Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, some of it in the open, some of it not in the open, with Morocco, okay? That you have for the first time an open security cooperation between Israel and the Arab states that are facing Iran. That not only Iran has a border with Israel through Lebanon, and Israel doesn't have a border with Iran because it is so far. Now Israel, because of its very good ties in Bahrain and in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia, can also have a border with Iran where the Iranians should be very careful about what they do if we have this kind of cooperation. Israel is selling arms to the Arab world for billions of dollars. Okay, we have recently sold more than $3 billion of Israeli weapons to Arab states. This is a completely new reality. Now, everybody is very excited about normalization. You want to be excited about normalization? Okay, it's a good idea. But that's not the most important thing. It is cooperation, including security cooperation, on a very high strategic level that brings together Israel and the Arabs. So our regional situation has never been as good as it is today. True, Iran is a major threat, and I spoke about it. But if you want to fight Iran, fighting it with Arab states instead of fighting against both Iran and Arab enemies, the difference is dramatic. Our regional situation is better than the founders of Israel could have dreamed in their most outlandish, realistic dreams. I don't mean the romantic dreams, those that are strategically sound. It is very, 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 very good. Let me conclude my tour d'horizon speaking about Israel's situation on the international level, and immediately in the beginning remove the most negative and most insignificant thing, namely international organizations. The situation of Israel in international organizations is very bad, and it's unpleasant, but it doesn't matter very much. It's very bad, regardless of what Israel does, regardless of Israeli policies. It has zero to do with Israel. It has to do with the fact that it's dominated, international organizations are dominated by countries who are authoritarian, totalitarian, or barbaric. Okay, this is the overwhelming majority of it. And they have the majority. And they work together as a bloc. And the Europeans who want the favors of this bloc are willing to work with these countries. So you have this ridiculous situation where the Syrians are criticizing us for not being democratic enough, and the Libyans are criticizing us for not being sane enough, and the Saudi Arabians are criticizing us because we don't deal with women well enough. And so it's a joke. I mean, the whole thing is an insult to Western civilization, because this idea that the so-called international community, there is no such thing, the international community that is dominated by a majority of people who reject democracy, reject pluralism, reject every value that a civilized person will support. So our situation there is bad. It's getting worse. It doesn't matter very much as long as the Americans are willing to cast a veto. Let them say whatever they want. It doesn't matter. It would have been much nicer if anything could be done about it, but basically it's a lost case, and it doesn't matter. Now, what matters? What matters are three things. First of all, a very, very deep partnership with the United States, number one. Good and improving relations with most European and other democratic countries on a bilateral level, in spite of ridiculous criticism from the multilateral level, and the fact that when it comes to other important world powers, particularly China, India, to some extent Russia, Brazil, others, there is an enormous respect for Israel and good relations with Israel. Let me start with the American case. Even under Obama, Obama was unfriendly to Israel, not because he was hostile, but because he didn't understand what is going on, and he's very, I don't know, cut off from reality perception, as if you settle the Israeli-Palestinian issue and then the Middle East becomes less unstable and then everybody is happy. I mean, something that is completely not even related to reality, not even remotely related to reality. Even under Obama, the relations between Israel and the United States became stronger. There is a constant process of weaving Israel into the American strategic system, because the Americans understand that not only do we have a common ethos with the United States, unlike the European ethos, at least until the Ukraine, that believes that any use of force is by definition illegitimate. Or almost every use of force. I hope this is changing now with the Ukraine war. I'll say a few words about it in a moment. In America, the understanding, if you don't have a big stick, you can't speak softly. And whereas you have presidents like Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama who do not subscribe to it, who are European presidents basically, the American people, if you go beyond the East Coast and the West Coast and the academic community and the Jews, basically you have Americans still believing that when push comes to shove, the use of force, or at least the credible threat of the use of force, is absolutely necessary. So the Israeli ethos is much closer to the American ethos than to the European ethos, and it's very important. You cannot explain why 2/3 of the Americans support Israel without this element. And in addition to it, and people underestimate this component, strategically speaking, Israel is not a welfare case for America. Oh, these nice Israelis, let's be nice to them. This could have been true in the 1950s, perhaps in the 60s, but now Israel is the only ally of the United States who is at the same time strong, stable, responsible, always pro-American, and more important than anything put together, the only ally of the United States who is willing to fight without American soldiers. I mean, not only do we not insist on it, we insist on not having it. We insist on defending ourselves by ourselves. And Americans appreciate it, and they appreciate it very much. And Biden, unlike Obama, he has a policy of contradictions, but it's better to be contradictory from an Israeli point of view than to be very systematic in the wrong direction. Obama was systematic in the wrong direction. Biden, at the same time when he wants to bring back the JCPOA, which is very negative from an Israeli point of view, nevertheless is also willing to strengthen Israel at the same time. And he understands, recently, his visit in July was an important reflection of the turning point, that you must also strengthen Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain, and you need the people who are on your side. You cannot try to appease the Iranians, and therefore you don't need to strengthen your allies. Biden is willing, and he proves that he is willing, also to strengthen Israel, although he knows that Israel is against the agreement with Iran, and that Israel will take and is taking on a minor scale, but will take on a major scale, effective means of forceful means to prevent by force Iran from doing to Israel and to other countries in the Middle East what the Iranians plan to do. So this by far is the most important. This is more important than the rest of the universe put together. Okay, their relations with the United States. Also, Israel has good bilateral relations with most European countries. The only country in Europe that is still hostile to Israel is Ireland. We used to have Sweden and Ireland, but Sweden changed. And it changed because it came to grips with reality. The Swedes in 2015 accepted more of the kind of immigrants that they should not have accepted in 2015, and now have adopted a very restrictive policy. And the prime minister, the socialist prime minister, admits that integration is a failure and that you need to work much more closely with the police. But what changed in Europe dramatically is the Ukraine war and the understanding that the fantasy of the Europeans, as if you should not consider cultural differences. You know, everybody is developing towards this European perception of the world with the so-called international community that devises rules, and everybody accepts the rules of and this fantasy of interdependency, because the Russians are as dependent on European money as Europeans are dependent on Russian gas. Europe can become totally dependent on Russian gas because, after all, both sides are dependent. They treated the Russians as if they're Europeans. They treated Putin as if he is a kind of European leader that is answerable to his own people. They were not willing to accept that cultural differences are by far the most important component when you come to discuss human behavior. Because once you mentioned culture in Europe, everybody called you a racist, because they couldn't live with the idea that different cultures will have different priorities. Even if they want the same, the priorities is what counts. And what constitutes good life is very different for Saddam Hussein than it is for Florence Nightingale. This was not their understanding. The Europeans completely misread history, and the war in Ukraine brought them to what a socialist, an SPD chancellor in Berlin, calls Zeitenwende. In other words, there is a shift that changes things in a very fundamental way. And Germany is increasing its expenditure on security from 47 billion euros per annum to 100 billion euros per annum. This is a dramatic change in Europe. And the more the Europeans learn from the Ukraine war, the more countries that were already in good relations with Israel improve their relations with Israel, buy Israeli weapons, learn from Israeli experience, because how a civilized democratic country defends itself from a barbarian on the other side of the border, Israel can teach everybody, because this is what Israel is doing for a very long period of time and developing the means in order to do it. So our situation in Europe is good and improving. Again, the fantasy, just say something about the Palestinians and then the Middle East will be stabilized and everybody will be happy. The ridiculous fantasy is much less popular in Europe today than it was among decision makers. Maybe in the universities or among some artists, it is still very popular, but when it comes to decision makers, I think they're much more realistic now than in the past. And as I mentioned before, this relationship of Israel with other powers, with China, with India. India is tremendously important, with Japan, with, to a lesser extent, with countries like Brazil, and this can change with the elections that are going on at the moment. But basically, everybody respects Israel, even those who don't like Israel. Respect Israel, understand how important Israel can be when it comes to innovation, understand how dangerous it is to push Israel into a corner and try to impose on it, how ridiculously impossible it is to do so. But even if they would try, it would be counterproductive from their point of view. So when it comes to Israel on the world scene, we're basically in a good situation. Let me sum up everything that I said so far. Does Israel have serious problems? The political instability in Israel domestically, Iran on the regional level, the fact that Israel is still being criticized in important places, even if they don't make decisions, it is not very comfortable to be strongly criticized in international organizations and in campuses around the world. Yes, Israel has these problems, but the ability to deal with it, there is a very well-known saying, God gives problems and challenges, and God gives shoulders, okay? The problems of Israel are much greater than most countries, certainly most democratic countries have. But the shoulders of Israel are much stronger than before, much broader than before. So the ability of the Israelis to deal with these challenges is much better than before. So on this happy note, let me stop here, and I'll be delighted in this particular forum where I'm speaking today. If people want to ask questions, I'll be delighted to try to respond. Thank you.